Today, the Trump presidential transition is underway in West Palm Beach, and the to-do list is long. As many as 4,000 government positions need to be filled with less than 75 days until the inauguration. But one critical staffing decision has been made. Trump has named Susie Wiles as his White House chief of staff. She largely ran his campaign, been close to him for years, and will be the first woman ever in that role. A Politico profile published before the election features interviews with insiders who know her well. They call her the most valuable political advisor in the country, a brilliant tactician, the most intelligent person I've ever worked with, and one of the most consequential people in American politics. Meredith McGraw is national political correspondent for Politico. Sarah Matthews served as deputy press secretary in the Trump White House. It's good to have both of you here. Meredith, Susie Wiles, first of all, interesting to hear people talk about her like that when most of Americans probably had never heard of her. But she also has what some people might think is an unexpected background. She's a self-described moderate. Tell us what else, when you did that profile before the election, you learned about her, when Politico did, particularly in light of what her new job is going to be.
Well, Susie Wiles joined the Trump operation back in early 2021, really at a political low point for Donald Trump. And she is a big part of the reason why he was elected president today. She helped guide his political operation over the past few years. She was his co-campaign manager along with Chris LaCivita, and she really built out his campaign operation that has been praised for its being professional and being a well-run political machine. And Wiles is well known in Republican circles. She's worked for a number of Republican candidates over the years. She's particularly well known in Florida, where she had based her career for decades. And she's really well respected and liked by the people who have worked with her over the years. And she's particularly close to the Trump family and the Trump team, and is seen as a really positive pick for Trump as he's building out his next administration.
Sarah, as someone who's been on the inside, for example, when you worked there, you know how many people would come and go from the Oval Office. Far more people had unfettered access, and the kinds of people who had unfettered access that would not have in previous administrations. What do you make of Susie Wiles and what she might bring?
I don't know Susie Wiles personally, but from everything that I've heard, she's a true professional. And I heard that one of her stipulations for accepting the role was that she wanted to keep the clown car out of the White House. And to someone like me, that's music to my ears and definitely a good sign of the type of ship that she wants to run. But at the same time, I know that General Kelly also had the same rule when he took the job for White House Chief of Staff. And he was only able to control the Oval Office and who was coming and going for a short period of time. And so we'll see if she's able to maintain it. Obviously, she was with Trump this entire campaign, which is a feat of itself, because you look at the previous campaigns he's ran, he went through multiple campaign managers. So I think that that does say something about how she knows how to expertly manage Donald Trump. But we'll see if it translates into the White House, because I know, at least for General Kelly, for example, it became too difficult to have to constantly be the gatekeeper for who was going into the Oval while also doing the day-to-day job of being White House Chief of Staff. But if the White House is going to be staffed by more people like Susie Wiles and less people like Steve Bannon and Mike Flynn and those types, then I think that that's a positive sign.
What do you think it was? I mean, look, the staffing, Sarah, on his first term was volatile, to say the least. He had more coming and going than had happened in a very long time. I think something like even 20 cabinet turnovers alone in just 4 years. What is it that has to be managed? Can you kind of give us some insights into why that is such a very difficult job?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for a first Trump term, he had no idea kind of what he was doing. And so they were learning how government operated while at the same time trying to run the country. And so that seemed to prove a little bit difficult. And then I think it gave way to people trying to push their own agendas on Trump. And it became kind of a power play within the West Wing where people were constantly going behind each other's backs, knifing each other. And that's not a way to operate. You know, everyone should be on the same team. And so I think that in this administration, in the second Trump term, I bet that's something that Susie Wiles will be trying to keep in check and trying to contain the chaos. But at least with Donald Trump, there's always going to be chaos. And so it's just how do you adapt and survive in that environment and try to maybe curb some of his worst instincts. And I'm hopeful that he will have people around him who push back on him. But that's been one of my fears with the second Trump term is that it's going to be no guardrails and there won't be enough voices pushing back on him. But I hope that they're able to contain the chaos as much as they can.
So let's talk about what's happening right now, Meredith. We know, for example, one of the people who has access to Donald Trump is Elon Musk. He's cultivated a real relationship with him. But you did some reporting on other billionaires who are key to this transition effort. Who are they and what kind of influence do they have?
Well, let's start with who's running the transition. We have Linda McMahon, who was the former small business administrator in the Trump administration. She went on to be a leader over at America First Policy Institute, which is a conservative think tank that was created by a lot of former Trump administration officials after he left the White House. And she was a major donor to Trump's campaign. And we have Howard Lutnick, who is the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, another major donor to Donald Trump. And they're right now tasked with running this transition operation, which is a huge undertaking. And we know that Linda is taking the reins of the policy side while Lutnick has been working on personnel. At the same time, Lutnick has ruffled some feathers for some of the interviews that he's done and comments he's made about the type of role that RFK Jr., another person who's involved with the transition, might have. But those are the two who are running the operation at this point, along with other people like Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump. And of course, RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard are involved as well.